Bible killer, Peter Tobin, a man who entered the history of the United Kingdom as one of the most dangerous serial killers. This man, who traveled all over the country and used about 40 pseudonyms to avoid disclosure of his previous crimes, was convicted of the murder of 3 women across the United Kingdom and the assault of 2 of the teenage girls. He was arrested when he was 60 years old, so the authorities feared the greatest of one hypothesis, which is that he may have been a murderer for more than 40 years, which means that there are many deaths that have not yet been discovered. Crimes of Peter Tobin. In 1993, Peter Tobin attacked 2 14-year-old girls after luring them to his apartment in Hampshire, drugged them, then raped them, and before leaving the apartment, he stabbed one of them, then opened the gas and locked them inside the apartment, and then fled to Coventry, but unfortunately for him the 2 girls survived, so she managed the police are able to know the characteristics of the assailant. After he was found, he confessed to his crime against the 2 teenagers, and he spent 10 years in prison. After his release in 2004 when he was 58 years old, he returned to Scotland and settled in Paisley. He did not have a shelter there, so he used to frequent the church table in Glasgow until he became one of its workers under a false name, Pat McLaughlin, and there he met the 23-year-old Polish student Angelika, who lived in the house next to the church. On September 24, 2006, Angelika disappeared, and 5 days later her body was found buried under the floorboards of St. Patrick's Church. And in the investigations, the witnesses confirmed that they saw her for the last time while she was alive, accompanied by Pat McLaughlin, who fled again from the area, and the police followed him until they found him, and with strong criminal evidence against him, he was convicted of her murder and received a life sentence. It is worth noting that Angelika had died a violent death, as she was beaten, raped, tied up, and stabbed 19 times before she was buried under the ground, where forensic doctors confirmed that she was buried there while she was alive. Peter's violent past. Psychologists and criminologists confirmed after studying the murder of Angelika that this crime, it wasn't Peter Tobin's first. All evidence indicates that he is experienced in this type of crime. It is very rare for a middle-aged man to commit a brutal murder all of a sudden. This type of advanced behavior begins at a younger age, roughly in his late teens to early 20s. Which means that he has been brutally killing for 40 years. Almost a year. Based on what the scholars said, the police went back to Peter's past, studied it, and compared his crime to other similar and unsolved crimes in the United Kingdom. Investigations led to the discovery of other crimes, including the finding of the bodies of 2 teenage girls who were killed by Peter Tobin and buried in the backyard of his former home. The investigation into the disappearance of Vicky Hamilton was reopened in 1991, when she was 15 years old at the time, and her last appearance was recorded in West Lothian. She was waiting for the bus less than a mile from Peter's house. Immediately after her disappearance, Peter left the area and headed to Margate. In Kent, when the police searched his house in Margate years later, they found the remains of Vicky Hamilton buried in the back garden, meaning that he took parts of her body with him when he left the area. A knife was also found that was used to kill Vicky as well. Based on this new evidence, he was again charged with murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment again. In 2007, a second body was found in the garden of Peter's house in Margate. Examinations confirmed that it was the body of 18-year-old Dina McNichol, who went out one day in August 1991 to attend a concert and did not return. It turned out that she was killed after Vicky Hamilton, as was done. Traces of the anesthetic amitriptyline were discovered in the remains of her corpse, which is the same drug that Peter used in the attack on the 2 girls in 1993. In 2009, Peter was brought to trial for the murder of Dina, and in just 15 minutes he was convicted of the charge and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation not to be released. Once again, you have shown yourself unfit to live in a good society. It is difficult for me to show you the amount of hatred and disgust that people feel for what you have done. The judge of Peter Twain, Peter's ex-wife, was one of his victims. He once stabbed her and he left her to die, but she was able to ask for help and she came to court years later to testify against him. In 2010, a woman named Patricia came to the police station, claiming that she had been assaulted and raped in Glasgow in 1968 when she was 15 years old, and Patricia said that she met a man in the Barrowland nightclub in Glasgow, he introduced himself as Jim McLaughlin. At the end of the evening, he asked her to set another date to meet him, but she refused and left, so the man called Jim followed her, and in a street devoid of pedestrians, he attacked and raped her, and almost killed her, but she fought a strong battle with him, so he ran away before someone came to him. The sound of her screams, that night Patricia escaped with her life, but the battle left traces of wounds on her face. Patricia was sure that Peter was the one who attacked her and that she was his first victim. But this time the accusation was not proven against Peter because there was no strong evidence against him, even with the presence of the name McLaughlin, which Peter used more than once in the past, and these were the last cases brought against Peter, despite his boasting at one time inside the prison and in front of the prisoners, by saying that he had killed 48 girls. Peter is currently serving a life sentence with 3 recommendations that he never be released under any circumstances. Victims of Peter Tobin, from right to left: Dina McNichol, 18 years old; Angelica Cloak, 23 years old; Vicky Hamilton, 15 years old. The description of the sister of one of his victims, who said that he is a young man of about 25 years of age, well-dressed, polite and eloquent, tall, slender, with red hair. She said that he introduced himself to them as John Templeton. She also said that he was religious, and he used to quote a lot from the Bible during his conversation with her, and told her that he did not drink alcohol and prayed, and this is what made her call him John of the Bible. It is believed that his first victim was Patricia, the 25-year-old nurse. On the day of her murder in February 1968, went out with her friend to the Barrowland nightclub to have a little fun, but she did not return that night, and the next morning her body was found by workers who were on their way to work. When they found her, she was naked and her clothes and bag were never found by the police. After a year and a half after that incident, John killed Jemima McDonald, 32, who had gone out to spend her evening in Barrowland and never returned. She was later found by her sister, who was worried when she heard the neighbors' children talking about a body that was found in an abandoned house, killed in the same way that Patricia was killed, and it was indeed the body that her sister heard about, and it was found after the examination that she had been severely beaten before being strangled, and like the previous one, her clothes and her belongings also disappeared. After only 2 months, Helen, 29, was spending the evening with her sister in the East End of Glasgow in October 1969. They met 2 men that night and left together in a taxi. Helen's sister got out of the car in front of her home and then waved to Helen that she would meet her tomorrow, but Helen never reached her home and was found the next morning murdered in the same way as Patricia and Jemima, and her killer was John. John's victims write to write: Helena Poddick, 29, Jemima McDonald, 32, Patricia Docker, 25. Hypotheses about John's true identity. The proposed theory was that John was a police officer on duty at the time John's crimes began. According to the book Dancing with the Devil, written by retired police officer Paul Harrison, the evidence pointed to a Glaxo police officer who fled and disappeared for no known reason, but investigations in this direction were halted on sovereign orders. Policeman Paul Harrison, author of the book, was one of the most skilled police officers in the United Kingdom. Provided important information in his book, including the testimony of the sister of Helen, the last victim of John, who was sure that the man she met that night and her sister left with him was a police officer. And the evidence that Paul considered decisive is the testimony of the workers in the club, who confirmed, after seeing the identity card of the accused policeman, that he was the same person who was sitting with the last victim and her sister, and said that he was one of the frequent patrons of the club, so they remember his face well. But as we mentioned above, investigations into John's true identity stopped at that time, but after many years, Peter Tobin appeared, and based on the testimony of criminologists and psychiatrists, and Patricia's complaint, the police came out with circumstantial evidence, all indicating that Peter is the same killer John, and in an attempt the police proved the validity of this hypothesis. Officer Joe Jackson, who was responsible for John's case years ago, was hired, and Joe confirmed that there really is something that unites Peter and John, which are things that are difficult to say are pure coincidence, including Peter's interview with his wife in Barrowland as the same nightclub where John found his victims, Pictures of Peter as a young man of 21 bear a striking resemblance to drawings police artists made of John's killer based on the description of those they saw. Peter keeps memorabilia, one of his victims, and so was John. John's crimes began in the Glasgow area at the same time that Peter moved to the region, and the strangest thing is that the crimes stopped during the years that Peter spent in prison on charges of forgery and theft. From the right, a picture of Peter Tobin at the age of 60, in the middle, Peter, at the age of 27, on the left, a drawing of the murderer called John, but Professor of Criminology David Wilson, who studied the crimes of Peter and the crimes of John, and wrote an entire book about criminals, had another opinion, and he mentioned in his book that there is a clear similarity between Peter and John in several things, but there are also differences between them. He also refuted the evidence of the similarity between Peter's pictures and the description of the sister of one of the victims, saying that this may mean that Peter committed the last crime, but there is no evidence that he committed the two previous crimes, and he also said that it is almost impossible to say for sure, and he suggested that there were two killers, one named John and the other Peter, who was imitating John in his crimes, perhaps out of admiration or an attempt to accuse him. To this day, the true number of John's victims is not known, as well as the victims of Peter. Is Peter the serial killer John or not yet, and despite the passage of more than 40 years, the evidence linking the two killers is still circumstantial and inconclusive. One person can answer all these questions, and he is Peter Tobin, who preferred to remain silent forever.